Well, the subtitle of our conference or event today is actually about tailoring services to the very diverse needs that exist in our community. And our next two presenters are going to continue taking us along that journey. They're two project coordinators from an initiative called Pieces to Pathways, a peer-led initiative that created Canada's first substance use program for non-binary gender, queer and trans youth between the ages of 16 to 29 years old here in Toronto. So Faith is a non-binary artist, grassroots community organizer, and writer. Faith identifies as a sober addict in recovery and has been sober for over 11 years. Congratulations. In their activism, art, and writing, they wish to politicize their experiences with substance use and sobriety, while unraveling the limited representation of the addicted body. Tim Mcconnell is a transmasculine person with lived experience of mental health, substance misuse, and trauma. They have previously worked as a peer support worker and substance abuse counselor at a youth residential treatment facility in New Brunswick. Welcome you both to the podium. Thank you.
Hello. We like to start with a story. So when I was 18, I was sent to a residential addictions treatment facility in New Brunswick, where I later worked. At that time, I wasn't out as trans, and I was using my assigned name and pronouns, so I was placed in the women's community of a strictly gendered facility. My presentation at the time was pretty masculine, and because I was assumed to be female, and certainly nobody talked about transness in New Brunswick in like mid-2000 and something, my presentation did not go over well with a lot of the counselors at this particular facility. One of the first exercises that they assigned me, which was shortly after, I think probably within a week of being admitted, was something that they called an image breaker. And what that involved was them taking all of my clothes. They also took all of my books because reading was frowned upon. But they took all of my clothes and they forced me to borrow clothes from other members of what was, at that point, a female community. So I, as like a closeted trans person, trying to express their identity through attire, ended up being forced under threat of discharge to wear like tight jeans, like blouses, heels, spaghetti tank tops, all of these things that made me incredibly uncomfortable. Because I wasn't out as trans at that time, the folks at this facility had found it really, really difficult to identify their behavior as being transphobic. But obviously there were some pretty cis-sexist assumptions being imposed on me that were very, very harmful. That might be an extreme example. Presumably that wouldn't happen now in this context, but being subjected to these types of assumptions as a queer or trans person trying to access support in cis and straight-centric spaces is definitely not uncommon.
For me, I started smoking weed every day at the age of 15, and in a matter of 4 years, I was shooting drugs. I was never a big drinker because it was always easier to get drugs. During this time, I started dealing drugs, got sent to psychologists, got in trouble with the law, got kicked out, stayed in the shelter system, was put on medication, had unprotected sex, didn't shoot drugs safely some of the time, ended up in psych wards, got in a lot of violent situations, saw drug counselors, got expelled but still graduated from high school, experienced a lot of drug-induced psychosis, overdosed a bunch, and somehow through it all I didn't die. I went to treatment and started going to 12-step meetings like Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous at the age of 19. Tim and I met in 12-step rooms, and we both got sober pretty young. Tim got sober at 18 and celebrated 10 years in July, and then I got sober at 19 and celebrated 11 years in August. For me, I was always open about my experience with addiction and recovery. Over the years, both Tim and I would regularly get referrals from friends or friends of friends, from people that were struggling with their substance use. So I would meet with people and go for coffee and just tell my story. I would share about my addiction, what I did to get sober, and what I did to stay sober. If someone wanted to go to a meeting, I would take them to a meeting. If they didn't, then I would try to refer them elsewhere. The majority of the people I would meet with were young, queer, and trans people. But what I was finding was that there weren't a lot of places I felt comfortable referring people to. If you're queer and trans and want to get sober but don't want to do 12 steps, then there aren't a lot of places to go. If you're queer and trans and want to do something about your alcohol and drug use, but don't want to get sober, there also aren't a lot of places to go.
Still you.
Oh, shoot. It's still me, apparently. Tim was coming across similar experiences in their life. Both Tim and I have been involved with grassroots community organizing in Toronto and had the mentality that if you saw a problem with something, you just did something about it. So one day during the summer of 2014, we met for coffee and decided to start a program of our own. Because of our experience in 12-step fellowships, we saw the utility of a shared lived experience and a common identity. We saw that it brought people together. We envisioned Pieces of Pathways as a peer-based program. For us, this means that all frontline staff are queer and trans identified and have their own experience with substance use and recovery, however defined by the individual. Lived experience would be used both as an intervention strategy and as a tool to build community for people that were facing similar struggles. Simply, we wanted to create a place for our friends and people in our communities to go to. We thought that this would be a pretty simple process. We had a great idea. Clearly, there was a need for it, and no one else was doing it at the time. And we naively thought that the government would just give us some money. We quickly learned that it wouldn't be like this at all. We realized that there was pretty much no research looking at substance use among queer and trans people in Canada. It was also tough because coming from these communities, we already knew that substance use was an issue in the queer and trans communities, especially with young people, but we still had to prove it.
So fortunately enough, in December of 2014, we managed to get some money from the Toronto Central Lynn to conduct a needs assessment. They gave us 3 months, so we finished it by the end of March. During that time, we conducted a full literature review. We met with 28 different social service providers. We surveyed 640 queer and trans youth. We facilitated 5 focus groups with a total of 48 participants, and we packaged all of that into like a 100 and something page report for the Lynn. It was a lot. Thanks. So because we only had 3 months to do literally everything, we had effectively no time to do outreach for the project. And obviously, when you're engaged in any sort of needs assessment, you need people to respond in order to prove what you're trying to find. Fortunately enough, as queer and trans identified people, we had these huge existing social networks ready to disseminate the survey, the call for participants. We had venues and other drop-in spaces that we'd been attending for years willing to host us. And it was really at that point that we began to experience, although it had always been important to us personally, the utility of community-led, peer-led initiatives. So we got a huge amount of support from other queer and trans folks in Toronto, primarily in facilitating outreach through social media and just generally bringing a lot of visibility and a lot of credibility to that project. Folks could look at it and recognize us as people who came from their communities, who were not simply researchers who were going to parachute in, take, and then leave. And that was really, really important for people to see. So what did we find in this process? There's a slide. Cool. So we looked at a whole bunch of different things in our survey, which is largely what we focus on in these presentations. So we found that 44.2% of survey respondents said that they were either actively trying to or would like to reduce or eliminate their drug use. We found that 36.8% of those folks said that they would like to or were actively trying to reduce or eliminate their alcohol use. We also found that past year prevalence rates amongst queer and trans youth in Toronto range from 1.19 to 57.2 times higher than those in the general Canadian population. And just to put that another way, that's an elevation of between 19.1 and 5,616.6%, depending on the substance. To put that in more concrete terms, because I like to do this at work, it's kind of like this cat. So there's a cat, and it's sitting in front of your house, and it's your friend. Maybe it's your best friend. My cat's my best friend. So you cuddle and you hang out and stuff, and this is like a super manageable cat. It like lives in your house, goes outside sometimes, whatever. So that's like substance use kind of in the general population. It's manageable. You go into queer and trans communities, and suddenly your cat is like that. So it's like fucking huge. And it won't go in your house, and you can't pet it because it'll kill you. And it's a really big, big issue. I learned how to use Photoshop when I went to film school. And I like cats, so yeah, cool. So we also found that 44% of survey respondents had accessed some kind of formal support for their substance use, and of that 44%, 65% said that provider and or client orientation towards their queer or trans identity negatively impacted their service use experience. When we looked at the specifics of those experiences, what we saw largely was that folks simply did not feel comfortable disclosing their identities. They did not feel accepted by staff members or other clients, and in some instances were actively mistreated, both by staff members and by other clients.
So what we have is a population that has significantly higher substance use prevalence rates than that of the general Canadian population. Many queer and trans people use alcohol and drugs to cope with the daily oppressions they face in their lives, and many use just to survive. When this population thinks that they might have a problem with their substance use, they are unsure if existing services will be able to meet their needs as a queer trans person. When this population actually goes to access support services, 2 out of 3 people have a negative service use experience based off of their queer and trans identity. This results in a population either having to engage in services that may be harmful to them or completely disengaging with services.
So in response to that, we came out of this process with a sense of what we wanted our program to look like. We knew that we wanted to provide peer-based services in which all frontline staff folks, and ideally everybody, would have their own experiences with substance use and recovery and also be queer and trans identified. We knew that we wanted to provide individual counseling and case management, and we knew that we wanted to provide separate community and group spaces for folks practicing abstinence and folks practicing harm reduction.
We're always very ambitious, and we pitched a program model with a dollar amount to the LIN, and they just said it was too much money. We spent the next year and a half trying to sustain the program. During that period, we got 6 months of one-time funding from the Toronto Central LIN to facilitate a series of pilot groups and develop a framework for an LGBT assessment and capacity building process so that we could conduct audits with other addiction and mental health service providers and help them to develop queer and trans competency. Over the course of a year, we also conducted a full LGBT assessment and audit with Renaissance, an organization that provides 12-step residential treatment services in Toronto. This included assessing current levels of trans competency within the staff team, going through all promotional and program materials, meeting with staff members, conducting site visits, offering recommendations, and being available to follow up. We work under the assumption that most people honestly want to do the right thing and provide accessible services to queer and trans people. Sometimes people do something they think will be helpful, but it isn't, and sometimes people just don't know what to do. For us, we realize that it's one thing to develop a culturally specific and developmentally appropriate program, but if this service is existing in a larger system that is inaccessible, then it's only addressing one need. So we see the LGBT assessment and capacity building process as integral to making larger system changes. We regularly provide consultation and training to many addiction and mental health service providers in Toronto.
Cool. So thanks to the support of an anonymous private donor who decided to inexplicably fund us for 1 year of service delivery, we have been operational for the past year. So we opened our doors on November 1st of 2016 with 3 program components. This is our program. So the first component is that we provide 3 community drop-in spaces a week. The first, which happens on Monday nights, if you know anyone, is for folks who are actively practicing or wanting to practice abstinence from one or more substances. We shifted from a more traditional definition of abstinence in response to some feedback that we got in our pilot programming. On Tuesday nights, we offer a harm reduction space specifically for racialized youth, and on Thursday nights, we offer an open harm reduction drop-in. So this is a community space where folks can come in, eat food, connect with counselors, we do workshops, we do check-ins, we do all kinds of fun stuff. We also offer individual counseling and case management, which includes one-on-one support, help with goal setting, skill sharing, providing referrals, supporting folks with appointments, and doing advocacy work. We also do a huge amount of text messaging. Thirdly, we also provide some structured group support, and we're currently collaborating with an organization called Stella's Place, which is based here in Toronto, to offer a DBT skills group for queer and trans substance users. Maybe skip the evaluation, or don't. It's up to you, I don't care.
Very quickly, we did some evaluations of our last program in partnership with Youth Recs and Evaluation Support Service through MCYS. And the 3 main things that we found were that having queer and trans identified staff members with their own lived experience own experiences with substance use and recovery allowed them to feel more comfortable and connected with our staff. Youth also reported feeling more understood and appreciated while receiving mentorship from people who had similar experiences. Secondly, participation in services helped folks enhance their peer networks and with new and healthy connections while developing a sense of community with their fellow peers. Third, folks appreciated that they were able to pick program elements that best met their needs, including attending multiple drop-in nights and having access to responsive case managers throughout the week with ongoing tech support. This was perceived as less stigmatizing and more empowering. 2 weeks ago, after 3 years of hard work, we got confirmation from the Toronto Central Inn that Pieces to Pathways would be receiving permanent funding through the Ministry of Health. This is fortunate because we were going to have to shut down again in December if we didn't get that. As we move forward with this work, we continue to rely on other organizations to provide a level and a type of service beyond our scope, including withdrawal management services, residential treatment, trauma therapy, etc. Often these services are gendered, leaving us to support our trans and non-binary clients to navigate environments that were not made for them. We are not trying to dissuade organizations from providing identity-specific services. What we are asking is for folks to seriously reflect on how the category of quote-unquote women is being constructed and to consider how this impacts the ability of trans and non-binary people to access services. I got like 1 more minute. All right? This is one more minute. If you work at a women's program, what are you doing to recognize trans women as women? Does your space acknowledge that not all people fit within the gender binary, that some people you categorize as women are not women, that simply identifying as a program being specifically for women implies that only cis women are welcome? If a person identified as a trans man hadn't medically transitioned but asked to use women's services, what would you do? If a person identified as non-binary, assigned male at birth, but wanted to access trauma services for sexual violence, and the only program available was for women, what would you do? If a person was a trans woman but didn't look like a woman and wanted to access women's services, what would you do? When I come to this work in a setting that delivers substance use support services to LGBT youth as a queer and trans person, most people assume that I'm gay. Most people also think that I'm a man, but I'm not. I identify as non-binary. And if you don't know what non-binary means, you should be writing that term down now and also Googling it afterwards. And if you don't know what they and them pronouns are, you should also be writing that down now and Googling that afterwards as well too. Because if you can't treat your colleagues and the people you work with in this field respectfully, then how could you ever expect to do so with the people that you serve? In the healthcare and social services field, arguably the top 3 most important access needs for gender variant people are all gender bathrooms, appropriate forms, and respecting pronouns. I have a lot of patience and tolerance when people don't use my correct pronouns or make assumptions about my gender and sexuality. Most of the people you're serving don't. Thank you.